Hi, everybody. Today, Thursday, June 19th, 2025, and our friend Norman Solomon is back with us. Welcome back, Norman.
Hi, thanks a lot, Nima.
Before I start, I want to introduce Norman. He wrote a very prominent and very important book in 2023, War Made Invisible: How America Hides the Human Toll of Its Military Machine. And he just pointed out in this all these wars that they were somehow provoked by the military industrial complex of the United States. Norman, right now we are dealing with the same situation as we saw with the war in Iraq, and they're trying to picture the situation the way that you have no option but to go to war with Iran. And before going to that, let me play a clip of Donald Trump answering to the press the way that he feels about the situation with Iran.
You are moving closer, or you believe the U.S. is moving closer to striking Iranian nuclear facilities. Where's your mindset on that?
I can't say that, right? You don't seriously think I'm going to answer that question? Will you strike the Iranian nuclear component? And what time exactly, sir? Sir, would you strike it? Would you please inform us so we can be there and watch? I mean, you don't know that I'm going to even do it. You don't know. I may do it. I may not do it. I mean, nobody knows what I'm going to do. I can tell you this, that Iran's got a lot of trouble, and they want to negotiate. And I said, why didn't you negotiate with me before? All this death and destruction. Why didn't you negotiate? I said to the people, why didn't you negotiate with me 2 weeks ago? You could have done fine. You would have had.
Yeah. Then he said, just moments ago, we've learned from the White House that Donald Trump would decide about going to war with Iran in the next 2 weeks. Your take on what's going on, Norman?
Well, we just heard the voice of a demagogue. This is somebody who treats the world as his plaything. He's somebody who is currently the governmental commander of a military-industrial complex that spends more money on military than the next 10 countries in the world combined. And most of those other 10 countries are US allies. So this is the voice, the expression, in his case, a flippant expression of a demagogic belief that the US should run the world as much as possible. And we're seeing the consequences when Israel is essentially part of the US military machine. They have a different command structure. They have somewhat different geopolitical goals, but overarching, very similar ones. And so it's really going to be a challenge for people inside the United States and around the world to bring enough pressure to bear to push back against this onslaught going on right now in Iran, and of course, almost 2 years now on Gaza as well.
Norman, when it comes to the Israeli attack on Iran, we know that the United States was negotiating, talking with Iranians. They wanted to meet on Sunday. Then Netanyahu decided to go to war to attack Iran on Friday.
Yeah.
From what we've learned from inside from Iran, those people who were collaborating with Israelis, they said they have been preparing for this attack for more than 10 years, a decade, for this operation. It was a huge operation, by the way, and many collaborators inside Iran helped Israel. And most of these people were just citizens of Iran participating, collaborating with Israel. And how we had a lot of problem with the Biden administration, but at least they had some sort of limits when it comes to the actions of Netanyahu and his administration. But it seems that those limits just not on the scene anymore. They're gone. There is no limits to what Netanyahu is doing.
There was a traditional Cold War attitude coming from the Biden administration. And I know many people here in the United States, they were understandably, as I was, so upset at the ethnic cleansing and the genocide going on, supported by the Biden administration in Gaza, that people said, oh, it can't get any worse. Well, it can get worse, as awful as the status quo can be. And as I think you're alluding to, Nima, we really have a renegade, no rules at all administration out of the White House now. The Trump people just don't believe in any rules whatsoever. It's the ethic of the gangster to get away with whatever firepower and leverage they can provide to bring to bear on the situation. It's not to say there isn't pushback. There certainly is, belatedly, from some European countries. Nations elsewhere in the world are trying to, I think, restrain Israel and the United States. And some of that's going on in Congress as we speak, but it's too little. It's not enough. And one of the structural problems with the U.S. government de facto is that the president not only is quote unquote commander in chief, but can do whatever the hell he wants and can literally blow up the world with nuclear weapons just on his own whim. So that's the frightening reality. And it's not as though Trump were a particularly stable person. That said, he's also a political person. And all the voices from different countries in the world, all the pressure that can be brought to bear within the United States, I think it's crucial right now. It's unclear whether the U.S. is going to attack Iran or not.
What is the main issue, Norman, when it comes to the talks between Iran and the United States? Because on one side, you see the United States, Steve Witkoff tried, in my opinion, was somehow some sort of change. He tried to do his best in both Ukraine and with Iran, but it wasn't, the people behind the scene were running the show. It wasn't about Witkoff and the way that he was trying to do something. It was the way that they wanted something with Iran that was unrealistic when it's done, no enrichment. And when you have 3 to 5%, you have literally no threat to anybody, but just providing with helping with the science, I don't know, agriculture, desalination, various things that they can help the science within the country. But Donald Trump right now, even with the latest news that I've mentioned, that he's going to decide in the next 2 weeks if he wants to go to Iran. White House says no enrichment, and they're not going to get it from Iran. Your take on that?
You're making some really good points. You had referred to a couple of minutes ago that there were negotiations planned for last Sunday between the U.S. and Iran again. And clearly what Netanyahu chose to do is blow up, essentially, by preempting that next stage of negotiations. Israel has clearly wanted to attack in a big way Iran and had preference for, as well, the United States to attack Iran for at least 20 years. They made no secret of that. And the possibility that the nuclear deal that Obama reached with Iran 10, 12 years ago, and then the possibility that it could be reinstated was really considered to be a very ominous threat to the agenda of the Israeli government. So rather than take the risk that there could actually be progress last Sunday in negotiations and an agreement, this war of aggression was begun by the Israeli military against Iran. I think we ought to remember that at the Nuremberg trials in 1945, the judgment was that waging an aggressive war is the supreme international crime. And this is a crime that is being committed repeatedly by governments with the most powerful militaries. The United States in Afghanistan and Iraq, Libya leading the NATO attacks on that country 14 years ago, Israel repeatedly in the Middle East, and now Israel with U.S. backing attacking Iran. And I should mention Russia attacking Ukraine a few years ago, a war that continues. These are criminal enterprises on a really large scale. And I think that the threat of peace, so to speak, is just so unnerving and disturbing to warmongers like Netanyahu and Trump, Putin, one could say, perhaps. And certainly even you could make an argument that Biden was opposed to peace because it did not comport with the geopolitical interests of U.S. foreign policy in the case of Gaza. So we've had two successive U.S. administrations directly complicit in genocide, something that, according to Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, has been going on in Gaza now. And it's necessary, I think, wherever we live, whatever our nationalities, politics, or whatever, to say that war is a pathway to global destruction, and we need a very different course.
How do you feel about the Trump administration? Do you think that as time goes by, the things are getting worse? And who's going to put pressure on them? I don't see anybody. Even we have some sort of fraction within MAGA right now. There are people against him, against these endless wars. How do you see this sort of pressure on him?
There's certainly a split within the MAGA Republicans over going to war with Iran, although as Steve Bannon, who's basically a neo-fascist advisor to Trump, said in the last day, if Trump goes in, then we'll probably get on board. So I don't have much confidence in some of those MAGA people who are now dissenting if Trump does give the orders for sending in 30,000-pound bombs to drop on Iran, which is what's on the table right now. Broadly speaking, although there is a split among some MAGA Republicans in Congress, they're basically stalwarts for a fascistic party at this point. It wasn't true of the Republican Party 10 years ago. Yes, it was right-wing. It was not fascistic. Now it is by the playbook. Jason Stanley, the scholar who's been at Yale, just went off to Canada because he feels that the US is going fascist. He wrote the great book, How Fascism Works, and he identified a lot of the signposts and what is involved with various characteristics of fascism. Those characteristics are coming into play more and more. And so in the last several months since inauguration of this year, January, for the second Trump administration, by week, it's getting worse and worse. Disappearing people who are dissenting if they don't have complete citizenship, firing rubber bullets at anybody who gets in the way in Los Angeles and elsewhere, calling in the Marines and the National Guard into Los Angeles. These are just a few characteristics of what is in place, and we don't know how far it's going to go. I think there are comparisons, Orban in Hungary, Bolsonaro in Brazil, elsewhere where we've seen the consolidation of right-wing power. It has common shared characteristics, very macho, pseudo-masculinist, against immigration, implicitly or explicitly racist, attacking universities. This has gone on historically when dictatorships have taken over in one country on one continent after another. Education is dangerous. Schools are dangerous. Universities are seen as bastions of the enemy. So we're seeing a lot of this, the ICE raids, swooping in, people who don't wear uniforms. They don't have badges. They work for the ICE agency in the US, and they're sweeping in. They're going to stores where immigrants work, some of them undocumented, and they're being disappeared, and they're being sent to holding places or deported. We have all the indications of a consistent pattern that is pursuing a plan to ship some people to prisons, hellish prisons in El Salvador, which unfortunately is run by a fascistic leader there. So long story short, I think we have momentum towards a fascistic regime in the United States, but we don't know how it's going to play out. It's really up for grabs. And I would say that the congressional election coming up 18 months from now, November of 2026, that will be crucial because while the Democrats are very unlikely to take the Senate, they could take the House. And that could be somewhat of a blockade towards further consolidation of Republican power.
Do you feel when you look at what's going on right now in the Middle East and what has happened during the war in Iraq and before the war in Iraq, do you see the similarities of what's going on?
Well, I think there are really chilling parallels. And having lived through the time when there was the propaganda barrage under George W. Bush, and weapons of mass destruction, we were told, were held by Saddam Hussein. There's the famous, infamous statement by President Bush at that time, we don't want a smoking gun to turn into a mushroom cloud. This is very similar to the kind of rhetoric that we're getting from the acolytes of the Trump administration, some Democrats as well. A lot of it, let's face it, is a kind of a frenzy for Zionism that has given a blank check, tremendous amounts of money, not only the $3.8 billion a year hot wired in automatically going from the US Treasury for military aid to Israel, but just huge numbers, tens of billions of dollars worth of weapons to Israel, specially sent to keep this genocide going. So there are, I think, a lot of parallels. There also are some sadder and wiser people who supported the invasion of Iraq who now see that was just so unhinged, and they're consciously bringing up, they're explicitly saying, we shouldn't do this again. So it's a clash between people who know better and the power of the military-industrial media complex in the United States.
Do you think that they want regime change in Iran, or their main goal is the Iranian nuclear program?
I think absolutely there's a motive for regime change coming from the United States, the neocons by whatever name. Netanyahu, of course, wants that. And I think there's a solid analysis as well that the ethnic cleansing, the slaughter, the mass murder and genocide in Gaza has, while it's been a horror for Palestinian people, civilians there in Gaza, it has sort of run aground. You know, there was a lot of enthusiasm in Israel, now less so. It's politically sort of rebounded to no longer work so well for Netanyahu. After all, just wants to stay out of prison since he's so corrupt. And so now the attack on Iran, among other things, is a way to divert attention from, on its own terms, the Israeli military's failure in Gaza. So I think there's that. But certainly underneath it, regime change, you know, that got a very bad odor when what happened in Iraq happened. I mean, not that there's been any particular compassion for the victims of Pentagon firepower from the US government or military or mass media for that matter, but because US troops were in Iraq year after year after year, the cakewalk that was promised never happened. And there's been a disaffection and disillusionment to some degree among some of the, you might say, ruling class in the United States that, hey, this didn't work, the regime change didn't work out so well. But certainly on the wish list is, as was successful regime change in Syria, ultimately with Assad going down, there's a hope for a regime change in Iran. I think it's somewhat irrational. It's certainly destructive and could, in seeking regime change, bring out tremendously negative, horrific results. But I think we ought to remind ourselves that President Biden, a few years ago, when he was in office, a couple of times basically said he wanted regime change in Russia. How crazy is that? When the leader of one nuclear superpower says that he wants to get rid of the leader of another nuclear superpower. This goes to, I think you're reminding me of this double standard among many about assassination of political leaders. You know, that's supposed to be a taboo because what goes around comes around. And yet a couple of days ago, President Trump said, well, the head supreme leader in Iran, no, we don't want to kill him now, but we'll see about later on. Well, that's a direct threat. And you may remember that in the past, some of the flags that were waved on why the United States had to attack, we were told, Iraq was that supposedly Saddam Hussein had planned to assassinate President Bush. Well, that really wasn't true, but it was so outrageous, it was just another excuse to attack Iraq. So this is, as the saying goes, it's a very, very slippery slope that we're being tossed down with encouragement to try to find military solutions that are not military solutions at all. They're the opposite of that.
If something happens between Iran and the United States together with Israel, I think Europe, that was hit by the war in Ukraine, and they literally devastated Europe, Germany especially. And right, if something happens with the Middle East, we know the importance of the Strait of Hormuz, the Bab al-Mandab in the Red Sea. Do you see any sort of political will in Europe to assume some sort of responsibility for what's going on in the world?
Well, that's I think a key question. Europe has been, as a set of governments, the European Union, very disappointing in terms of the genocide in Gaza. Yes, there have been statements made by Macron in France and elsewhere, certain measures, the UK, I think, withdrawing some military aid and support, but basically it's been too little too late. As you point out, the threat in terms of flow of oil and so forth coming out of the entire region, that would seem to really threaten. I mean, winter's going to come on again. What does that mean for Europe? And it's really, to me, unclear, how that would play out, but it would be very negative. So on the one hand, one would think that the motivation from European governments would be to say, to pressure Israel as much as possible and to encourage the US to do so. After all, the US military and the Israeli military are so closely intertwined. As I say, they have a different command structure, but they basically have the same overarching goals and operations and geopolitical outlooks and agendas. So we really have a failure to take responsibility from so many of the countries that might have the most leverage over Israel. That said, it's a point of pride from Israel and the top leaders there that they go their own way. And one of the contradictions, of course, is they can't go their own way unless the US continues to supply them with weapons.
We have, looking at the bigger picture of what's going on in the world, we have two superpowers. If we assume we have three superpowers, but two of them are so much in fight right now. They're not fighting visibly, but invisibly they're fighting each other, China and the United States. We had the tariff war in China, and when the Trump administration, Donald Trump, decided to back down finally. But you see, look at China and the way they're trying to deal with Russia, Iran, Africans, you name it. They're looking for partners. They're looking for someone to work with. When it comes to the United States, it's totally the opposite. They're looking for puppets. They're looking for someone to obey. And this is, don't you think that this sort of policy is getting old? Those old days are gone, not anymore.
One would think it's an old playbook that the US is playing by. Really, I mean, the US is a military superpower, but economically weakening. You have BRICS, you have these several countries that have enormous economic and growing power in terms of commerce, in terms of trade, as you point out. It's really almost funny when the right wing, and by the way, the Democrats really are focused on Russia as an adversary and China as an adversary. The Republicans see, oh no, we shouldn't be polarizing so much with Russia because we want to have a war with China, But both of them, both sectors in the U.S. two-party system really are not only denouncing China, how dare they have vessels in the South China Sea, military vessels, and not even mentioning the middle name of the South China Sea, as though there might be reasons that the Chinese military would have vessels there. But also part of the Bill of Particulars to condemn China is they actually invest money in Africa. I mean, how terrible. They actually engage in commerce. And so maybe it's a sort of a jealousy. I mean, as you refer to, the U.S. is involved in Africa, as the great journalist Nick Turse has pointed out. The U.S. has trained and is engaged militarily with virtually every government on the entire continent of Africa. And many times when there's news that comes out that a coup has taken place against a democratic government in Africa, replaced with a junta, it turns out that the junta leaders who overthrew the democratically elected government were trained by the US government. So it tells you something about the motives and the MO, how these different superpowers are operating. This is not to laud China as some kind of paragon of democracy. It's clearly not a democracy inside China, but it does say that the foreign policies are really very different.
We had a fight between the two figures of the MAGA, Elon Musk and Donald Trump. And Elon Musk came out and against Donald, he said that we need a third party. Even someone like Elon Musk feels that the United States needs a new party to serve the people. You mentioned the two parties and how they're involved, they're complicit in what's going on with these endless wars. How do you see the possibility of having a third party, as it doesn't seem that Donald Trump would be successful in his term. It shows he's lost. Before coming to power, he said, I'm gonna put an end to the war in Ukraine. He didn't do that. He didn't put an end to the genocide in Gaza. He started this new war with Iran. I don't see that going away soon. It's gonna continue in some way. But what would be the outcome of this sort of behavior on the part of, we had Joe Biden, Democrats, we have Republicans, right now MAGA, nothing changed. What is the solution, Norman?
The prospects of a third party being electorally successful in the United States in terms of federal elections for Congress, for presidency, those chances are basically zero. That's the way that the structure of US elections functions. That's what the structure is. I know when I read about, say, elections in Spain or, say, Germany, and I see the multi-party composition of the parliament, the Bundestag in Germany a few months ago, the Die Linke party got close to 10%. They have seats in the parliament. I really envy that kind of system. We don't have that in the United States. It's first past the post, winner take all in these elections. And so it's simply the structure, and the function of a third party is, in theory, to introduce new ideas, but not really the most effective way to do that. I hope Elon Musk was serious about a third party, but I really, really doubt he was. That was a moment of pique and anger and falling out personally with Trump. But when you look at the actual dynamics of having a third party, say for a presidential race, if we are on the left, and I certainly am on the left, I hope for a lot of third parties on the right, because that would fracture the right. And likewise, it's no accident that in the last few presidential elections, Republicans have tried to support the Green Party here because they've wanted to siphon off 1 or 2%, they hope, that could make the difference and defeat the Democrats.
Yeah. Norman, we are living right now in a very dangerous world as time goes by. The nuclear weapons Donald Trump is I don't know, in before coming to live, we learned that Donald Trump is considering a tactical nuclear weapon to be used against Iran in terms of the nuclear program, the facilities that they have, and they call it Fordo, is a nuclear facility in Iran, a nuclear program, and some location in Iran that they want to attack it. It's in the mountains, and they cannot access that with conventional weapons. That's why they're considering a tactical nuclear weapon. If the United States decides to use a nuclear weapon, a tactical one, how is that going to change the whole atmosphere of wars and what's going on today in the world?
It would change fundamentally the prospects for human survival on this planet. That's an insane idea coming from the White House, that there should be any consideration of so-called tactical nuclear weapons attacking Iran. They're already talking about using a 30,000-pound bomb to, they hope, eliminate a functional nuclear program in Iran, to blast open the mountain and so forth. Well, we already know what a 2,000-pound bomb has done again and again to people in Gaza, supplied by the United States. And the very thought of using so-called tactical nuclear weapons at all is just the height of insanity. It reminds me of something that is an epigraph to the great book by the Pentagon Papers whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg. The book is called The Doomsday Strategy, and it's a quote from the philosopher Nietzsche, who wrote that insanity in individuals is rare, but insanity in groups and societies is common. And we have an insanity about nuclear weapons. It's been promulgated for close to 80 years now, that somehow this is a sensible way to prepare for opposing one's enemies. In fact, it's suicidal, it's omnicidal. It is now a specter to basically eliminate not all of humanity, but some scientists say 98, 99% of humanity. There's some delusion that, well, people in certain parts of the world, in Africa or elsewhere, would survive a nuclear war. That's completely wrong. When you look at the data coming from scientists now, the data are clear that nuclear winter would ensue. Forget about agriculture. So how can, for 6 months, a year, several years, people survive on this planet without agriculture? It's the basis of basic human sustenance. So when we come down to it, we have a danger that these unhinged people in charge of the US government or the Israeli government might become so unhinged that they would contemplate and then actually use nuclear weapons. You know, there are two aspects you remind me of that, among others, that are propaganda and lies by silence, certainly in the US media, about this current crisis, these horrific events in the Middle East. One is, very rarely is it mentioned that Iran has a huge oil reserve there. Iraq invaded 20 plus years ago, number 5 in global oil reserves. Iran is number 4. And anybody who thinks that that is not a factor in what the hell is going on is sadly mistaken. The other rarely mentioned is that Israel has nuclear weapons. The estimates are from 80 to 200 nuclear bombs that Israel has. So one of the ironies is that, oh, you know, we keep being told Iran can't have nuclear weapons, but Israel does, and it's not even mentioned. And if anybody wants to assume that, well, you know, countries run by white people aren't going to use nuclear weapons against civilians, I got 2 words for them: Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Do you feel that Netanyahu could achieve what he wanted to achieve for more than, I would assume, 30 years? He wanted to attack Iran. Finally, he got it with the Trump administration. How do you see the achievements for Netanyahu and the way that he thought about this attack?
I think one of the tragedies of our age and the structures of government is that individuals cast such a large shadow. I'm on the left. I think analytically, when you look at the forces of history, so much of those forces have to do with economic power, have to do with who owns what and can use great wealth to exert leverage over governance. And so, from that standpoint, I believe, and I still think this is true, that those motor forces of history are largely based on economics and on the power of who dominates in the 24/7, 365 class struggle, which certainly exists, whether it's acknowledged or not. That said, individuals matter. And I reluctantly say that the individual personalities, whether it's Biden or Trump or Netanyahu, that really matters. And Trump had a motivation a couple of years ago, really, to be reelected so he could be sure that he wouldn't go to prison. And we know that Netanyahu has that as a perhaps top motivation. He wants to stay out of prison. War is good for demagogues. War is good for criminals. And so when we look at what's going on in Israel, there's a mass psychosis going on. Yes, there's trauma after October 7th. October 7th, 2023 was a horrible crime by Hamas and allied forces. And a much larger and sustained crime continues to go on, courtesy of the so-called Israel Defense Forces, visited upon civilians in Gaza. And now we have this huge international crime of the attack and war on Iran. So Netanyahu, he's an individual, but he's a symbol of a society that has accommodated itself to inflicting genocide, and that is the Israeli society.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Norman, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Thank you, Nima, for inviting me and for this program, which continues to be, I think, very valuable as you have guests to discuss these crucial issues.
Thank you. Take care, Norman.